Every living thing must die. That's the law of nature, undeniable, unchangeable, universal. A leaf falls, crumbles, and returns to dust. A child is born, grows old, and one day, breathes their last. Even prophets, kings, saints, and sages, no one escapes the final shadow. Death. But what if I told you that hidden deep within the oldest sacred text known to mankind, the Bible, lies a mystery that defies this very rule? That there were once 3 men, who never died. No grave. No funeral. No final breath. Only one simple record remains. They were no more. Who were they? Were they real men? Or were they symbols of something far beyond human comprehension? And perhaps the most haunting question of all: if death was not the end for them, could it be the same for us? Is it possible that death is not the final curtain, but only a veil? That there exists a kind of life that death cannot touch? The Bible doesn't dwell on these men. No long legends. No poetic elaboration. Just a few verses, a few cryptic phrases. And then, silence. But in that silence echoes a mystery that has stirred the hearts of seekers, scholars, and mystics for thousands of years. One was simply taken by God. Another vanished in a whirlwind of fire. And the last, no father, no mother, no beginning, and no end. Across all of human history, from Abraham to Moses to the apostles, only 3 men are ever described as having never tasted death. No sickness. No aging. No moment of parting. They simply ceased to belong to this world. Not because they were stronger. Not because they were better. But because they walked closer to God than any other in their generation. So let me ask you, what if closeness to God isn't just spiritual, but something that can break the very fabric of mortality? What if there's a way of living, so holy, so aligned with heaven, that death itself must step aside? Would you walk that path? Would you dare live as they once lived? Today, we'll uncover the stories of these 3 immortal men. We'll explore the clues they left behind, the divine patterns hidden between the lines, and the eternal truth that challenges everything we think we know about life and death. But don't just take my word for it. Let your heart decide. Because sometimes, true life begins where the world believes everything ends. Part 1: Enoch, the man who walked with God and was no more. Imagine a world without age limits, where people live not just decades, but centuries. Where 500 years old meant middle age. And where time, instead of humbling humanity, only gave sin more time to grow deeper roots. This was the age of Enoch. A pre-flood world overflowing with corruption. A time when evil wasn't just a temptation. It was a culture. A lifestyle. A system. Genesis describes that era in chilling simplicity. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6 verse 5. Sin wasn't hidden anymore. It wasn't shameful. It was normalized. Celebrated. Woven into every fabric of society. And in that dark, decaying world, one man chose to walk a different path. He didn't fight. He didn't rule. He didn't raise an army or lead a rebellion. He simply walked with God. The Bible only gives him one mysterious verse. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him. Genesis 5. No thunder. No divine chariot. No earthquakes or fire. Just one quiet disappearance, that changed everything. That single sentence hints at something so profound it echoes through millennia. There exists a kind of relationship with God so deep, so intimate, that death itself has no claim over it. Enoch lived only 365 years, a short life by the standards of his time. His son, Methuselah, lived to be 969, the longest recorded lifespan in the Bible. But it wasn't the length of Enoch's life that mattered. It was how he lived it. While others used long years to drift further from God, Enoch spent each day walking closer to him. He didn't build an empire. He didn't leave behind monuments or scrolls or prophecies, at least not in a canonical sense. He didn't perform miracles. He didn't call fire from heaven. But in the quiet rhythm of life, step by step, day by day, he chose to walk with God, not ahead of him. Not beside idols. Not on his own. Just with God. And that was enough. Today, people chase dramatic spiritual experiences. They crave signs, wonders, supernatural encounters, heaven splitting open and voices from above. But Enoch teaches us something deeper. Sometimes, the greatest spiritual victory is not in the loud, but in the loyal. Not in explosions of faith, but in quiet obedience. Enoch's walk wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. And that consistency became holy. In the book of Hebrews, Enoch reappears, not as a legend, but as a symbol of true faith. By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death, for before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Hebrews 11. He pleased God. Not because of rituals. Not because of perfection. But because of faith. Faith that walking with God is enough. Faith that even in a rotting world, you can choose light. Faith that holiness is not about being noticed, it's about being known by God. But there's more to Enoch's story. Much more. Outside of the canon, a mysterious ancient text known as the Book of Enoch paints a radically expanded picture. According to this text, Enoch didn't just walk with God, he soared into the heavens. He was taken through multiple levels of the sky, shown cosmic secrets, and witnessed the fall of the rebellious angels known as the Watchers. He saw their crimes. He heard their confessions. And he was given a prophetic mission, to write down the coming judgment of God. In these writings, Enoch becomes more than a man. He becomes a vessel. A scribe of divine justice. The first prophetic seer of the apocalypse. It's no wonder the early church debated over his writings. And although the Book of Enoch was never included in most biblical canons, it was quoted by Jude in the New Testament. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones. Jude 1. This isn't mythology. This is sacred memory, half remembered, half veiled, of a man who escaped death, and glimpsed eternity. But why Enoch? Why him, of all people? Some scholars believe Enoch is a type, a foreshadowing of the righteous remnant who will be taken before God's wrath is poured upon the earth. Just as Enoch was taken before the flood. Some believe the faithful will be caught up before the final judgment. Rapture theology finds its roots here, not in Revelation, but in Genesis. Enoch is not just a man. He is a sign. But the real question is not what happened to Enoch. The question is, can we live like he did? Can we walk with God in a world walking away from him? Can we practice quiet obedience in an age of noise? Can we choose holiness, not for applause, but for intimacy? Enoch's story is not about escape. It's about pursuit. He didn't run away from the world. He chased after God. He didn't avoid death out of fear. He walked toward life, eternal life, one step at a time. And eventually, the line between earth and heaven just disappeared. Today, we're told that meaning comes from what you build, what you own, how much time you buy. But Enoch teaches us that eternal impact doesn't come from doing more. It comes from walking better. From knowing who you walk with. His life reminds us. You don't have to be famous to be remembered in heaven. You don't need a crowd to find the presence of God. You don't need to live forever to escape death. You just need to walk. Perhaps the greatest miracle in Enoch's story is that there was no miracle. No flames. No thunder. No drama. Just a man. And his God. And one day, the walk continued. Into a place where time no longer mattered, and death could not follow. So the next time you feel ordinary, the next time you wonder if your quiet life of faith makes any difference, remember Enoch. The man who never died. Because he walked with the one who is life itself. And that path is still open. Even now. Even here. The question is, will you take the next step? Part 2, Elijah, the prophet taken by fire. If Enoch walked quietly with God, then Elijah stormed through history like fire through dry branches. His was not a life of silence or anonymity, but one of confrontation, courage, and mystery. And in the end, he did not die, he was taken, swept up into heaven in a whirlwind of flame. No grave. No decay. Only ascension. But to understand why Elijah was chosen for such an extraordinary exit, we must first understand the darkness of the world he lived in, and the fire that was required to stand against it. It was a time when Israel had turned its back on the Lord. King Ahab ruled the land, but the real power behind the throne was Queen Jezebel, a Sidonian princess whose beauty was matched only by her ruthlessness. She brought with her the cult of Baal, a god of storms and fertility worshipped through acts of sensuality, blood rituals, and spiritual deception. Under their reign, sacred altars were torn down. In their place, altars to Baal rose like weeds in a vineyard gone wild. Prophets of the true God were hunted down, silenced, executed. Morality wasn't just ignored, it was criminalized. Righteousness became rebellion. And truth? It became dangerous to speak. And into this collapse stepped Elijah. A man with no official title. No lineage of kings or priests. No army behind him. Just one voice, and a fire inside that refused to bow. His first recorded word struck like thunder through the silence, "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except at my word." In a land dependent on rain, he didn't just curse the weather, he cursed the very God they believed controlled it. This was not just a prophetic warning. It was a declaration of war. And then, just as suddenly, he vanished. God led Elijah to an isolated brook called Korath, hidden deep in the wilderness. Far from palaces, far from people. And there, the miraculous began. Each morning and evening, ravens, unclean, scavenging birds, known for feeding on the dead, brought him food. Bread. Meat. Sustenance from the sky. A silent miracle repeated without fail. Because when God decides to preserve someone, he doesn't need gold, grandeur, or logic. He can use even what others consider unclean, unworthy, or impossible. When God chooses to sustain you, even nature bends to his will. Years passed. And then Elijah returned, not as a fugitive, but as a storm. His mission? To expose the lies of Baal and remind Israel who truly held the heavens. He climbed Mount Carmel and issued a challenge to the prophets of Baal. 450 of them. One altar for Baal. One for the Lord. Let fire from heaven decide who was real. The prophets of Baal shouted, danced, even cut themselves, desperate for a sign. Hours passed. Nothing came. Silence. Then Elijah approached the altar of the Lord. Calm. Focused. He rebuilt it with 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. He drenched the wood and offering in water, soaking it beyond logic. And then he prayed. No theatrics. No frenzy. Just quiet certainty. And heaven answered. Fire fell, not like lightning, but like judgment. It consumed the offering, the wood, the stones, the water, the very dust beneath. It was not just power, it was proof. And the people fell on their faces and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." It should have been the turning point. But not all evil surrenders so easily. The very next day, Jezebel vowed to kill Elijah by sundown. And the prophet, this man of miracles, this slayer of lies, ran. He fled into the wilderness, collapsed under a tree, and begged God to let him die. It wasn't fear that undid him. It was exhaustion. The emotional toll of standing alone. The weight of seeing revival so close, and yet still out of reach. But what God did next reveals something precious. He didn't rebuke Elijah. He didn't demand strength. He sent an angel, twice, who simply said, "Eat. Rest. The journey is too much for you." Sometimes, God's answer to our collapse is not a command to rise, but an invitation to breathe. Renewed, Elijah continued his journey, not to overthrow governments, but to pass the mantle. He met Elisha, the prophet who would follow him. They walked together one last time, and as they crossed the Jordan River, Elijah knew, the end was near. But his end would be unlike any before it. Suddenly, the skies tore open. A chariot of fire, drawn by horses of flame, descended. A whirlwind wrapped around Elijah. And in an instant, he was gone, taken into heaven before the eyes of his disciple. No tombstone. No eulogy. Just glory. But something remained. As the fire faded, Elijah's mantle fell, a prophet's cloak, a symbol of spiritual authority. Elisha picked it up. A silent but powerful transfer. Because legacy is not measured by what you keep, but by what you pass on. And yet, Elijah's mystery doesn't end there. Centuries later, the prophet Malachi declared that Elijah would return, before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Some say this was fulfilled in John the Baptist, who came in the spirit and power of Elijah. But others believe he still walks the earth, or will, before the end of days. Perhaps as one of the two witnesses in Revelation who defy the Antichrist and call down fire once more. We don't know for certain. But what we do know is this: Elijah's story still speaks today. To those who feel overwhelmed by corruption. To those who speak truth into silence. To those who burn with purpose, and then burn out. His life is proof that God uses the broken, sustains the weary, and honors the faithful. Because Elijah was not perfect. He trembled. He questioned. He wept. But he never gave up on God, and God never gave up on him. And so now, a question remains, for me, for you, for anyone watching. Will you dare to stand, even when no one else will? Will you trust, even when silence stretches long and the sky seems empty? Will you live a life so faithful, so uncompromising, that when heaven opens once again, it comes not with thunder, but with fire? Part 3, Melchizedek, the priest without beginning or end. If Enoch walked with God. If Elijah was taken by fire. Then Melchizedek came like a shadow that never left. He appeared once. Then vanished. No origin. No death. And yet, his presence echoes across millennia, whispering a mystery deeper than death. We meet him not in prophecy, not in miracle, but in war. Genesis 14. A brutal battle between kings has just ended. Abraham, still Abram then, has returned victorious from rescuing his nephew Lot. Blood still dries on his sword when a strange figure steps out from the dusk. He is called Melchizedek, King of Righteousness. He rules over a place called Salem, peace. Righteousness and peace. Two names. One man. And yet, no lineage. No past. No future. No grave. He comes bearing no weapons, only bread and wine. He says nothing of war, only blessing. He speaks over Abram, not as a friend, not as a guest, but as a priest. And not just any priest, but one who receives a tenth of Abram's spoils. A tithe. An offering. A sacred act, reserved for God alone. Why would Abram, the father of faith, bow to this man? It makes no earthly sense. Unless Melchizedek was never merely a man. In that brief moment, something eternal pierced through time. A priest unlike any other. A king without borders. A servant who blessed the one chosen by God. And then, he disappears. We never hear of his birth. We never see his death. His story evaporates like breath in the cold. But not his legacy. Centuries later, King David, writing in Psalm 110, will speak a cryptic word from the Spirit. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. And 1,000 years after that, the writer of Hebrews will echo the same mystery. Melchizedek, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. Who is this figure? A human prophet? An angel in disguise? Or something more, divine? Some scholars believe he was a historical king, chosen by God to foreshadow the Messiah. A man made into a mirror. Others claim he was a Christophany, an early, veiled appearance of Christ himself, walking the earth before Bethlehem. Still others see him as a prophetic symbol, a whisper from the future, placed into the past. And maybe that's the point. Melchizedek defies category because what he represents transcends human structure. He is not a Levitical priest, those came from Aaron, centuries later. They offered sacrifices day and night, but none of them could cleanse the soul. They were mortal, broken men standing in the gap for other broken men. But Melchizedek? He stands outside the system. A priest-king. One who mediates and reigns. Just like someone else we know. Christ. In the book of Hebrews, Jesus is compared not to Aaron, but to Melchizedek. A priest not by lineage, but by eternal appointment. Not offering the blood of animals, but offering himself. In this way, Melchizedek becomes more than a man. He becomes a doorway. A glimpse of a greater reality, where kingship and priesthood unite, where bread and wine are more than food, but covenant, and where righteousness and peace kiss upon the lips of eternity. But here's where the mystery sharpens. Melchizedek came to Abram in a time of war. Not in the temple. Not in the sanctuary. But on the battlefield. He came when blood had been spilled. When exhaustion had set in. When Abram needed not more commands, but blessing. Bread. Wine. Words of peace. Isn't that exactly how God still meets us? Not when we are strong. But when we are spent. Not in palaces. But in the dust of struggle. God often comes to us the way Melchizedek came to Abram, without warning, without fanfare. And when he comes, it's not with condemnation, but with nourishment. He reminds us. You are not just a soldier. You are a son. You are not just surviving. You are chosen. And even the victories you win, are not your own. That's why Abram gave the tithe. Not because he had to. But because in Melchizedek's presence, he saw a holiness he could not ignore. So what does this ancient priest mean for us today? First, it reveals that God's plan was never limited to one tribe, one nation, or one system. Before the law, before Moses, before Levi, there was Melchizedek. And in him, we see a priesthood that transcends religion and points directly to the heart of God. Second, it reminds us that true kingship is not about domination, but intercession. The greatest leaders are not those who command with fists, but those who bless with bread. And third, it asks us a question. When you meet Melchizedek, when God steps into your moment with quiet holiness, will you recognize him? Will you receive the bread and wine? Will you bow? Will you tithe, not just your wealth, but your pride, your fear, your control? Because Melchizedek may come once in a lifetime. But when he does, he leaves behind a trail of eternity. We don't know what happened to him. But maybe that's the point. He wasn't meant to be followed, he was meant to point to a greater priest. A greater king. To the one who also offered bread and wine. To the one who had no sin, but bore ours. To the one who reigns in righteousness, and offers peace. Melchizedek was never the center. He was always the signpost. And now, the road he marked is open before you. 3 men. 3 journeys. And one impossible thing they share in common. Death never touched them. Not because they were perfect, but because they walked in something deeper, something eternal. Enoch, the man who walked with God so closely, he simply vanished. No fire. No battle. No final words. Just gone, swallowed into eternity by the very presence he cherished. He reminds us. Sometimes, the strongest faith makes no noise at all. It just walks. Elijah, the prophet who dared to speak when silence was safer. He faced kings, called down fire, fled in fear, then rose again in obedience. And in the end, he didn't die. He was lifted in fire and wind, a divine exodus from the dust of mortality. His story declares, when you stand alone for truth, heaven stands with you. And Melchizedek, the figure cloaked in timelessness, no beginning, no end. He appeared with bread and wine, blessed Abraham, received tithes like only God could. Then he disappeared, into prophecy, into priesthood, into mystery. The message? True authority does not die. It transcends. These 3 are more than just biblical curiosities. They are archetypes. Windows into the kind of life that outlives time. So now we turn the question to you. What kind of life are you living? Is it one of noise and ambition, chasing lights and names that fade like morning mist? Or is it quiet, anchored, hidden with Christ, yet thunderous in eternity? Will you walk like Enoch, choosing closeness with God over recognition from men? Will you speak like Elijah, even if your voice is the only one echoing in the darkness? Will you believe, like the shadow of Melchizedek, that your life is part of something eternal, unshakable, and unseen? Because in the end, heaven does not record applause. It records obedience. You were not made to blend into this world. You were made to burn with another kind of fire. A fire that, when your time comes, may not end in death at all, but in ascension. The mystery isn't just about them. It's about you. Will your story be one that death cannot finish?